Long live General Gaius Julius Caesar, savior of our republic.
When Game of Thrones came out, it changed the television landscape. With its use of giant armies, historical props, and an extremely high budget, it made mainstream the idea that a TV series could be as epic and sweeping as cinema. And since then, we've seen other networks try to recreate what HBO did with their own epic series, to varying degrees of success. However, as successful as Game of Thrones was, not many people remember HBO's first attempt at an epic series, Rome. Created by Bruno Heller, John Milius, and William J. MacDonald, the series follows famous historical figures like Caesar, Octavian, and Mark Antony as Rome transforms from a republic into an empire. The series was a co-production between HBO and the BBC, and was the most expensive show they had ever produced, even more than Game of Thrones. The high cost of the series ultimately resulted in the show being cancelled early, which is why the second season feels very rushed. But the lessons that HBO learned from Rome is the reason why Game of Thrones was even able to be attempted. But it's a shame that because of the success of the GOT franchise, Rome lies forgotten like an ancient ruin. Though I wouldn't necessarily classify it as a masterpiece like The Sopranos or Deadwood, what the series managed to accomplish was truly impressive. Not only was this one of the most authentic presentations of Rome ever created, but the series is also full of great moments that I still think about to this day. So, let's take a look at this epic historical drama, a true Roman retrospective for true Romans.
And the Romans? Where are they now?
You're looking at him, asshole.
The series is set in the final days of the Roman Republic, as the civil wars that we know from history are kicked off. We open with Caesar's victory at Alesia, and follow him as he crosses the Rubicon and marches on Rome. You'll recognize Ciarán Hinds as Caesar if you've seen Game of Thrones, and that's not the only crossover. HBO loves to use actors that they've worked with in the past. Alongside Caesar's story are other famous figures from the time. Caesar's right-hand man Mark Antony, played by James Purefoy, is one of my favorites. There have been many great portrayals of Mark Antony throughout the years. Marlon Brando and Charlton Heston in the Shakespeare adaptations, or Richard Burton in Cleopatra. But without a doubt, James Purefoy is my absolute favorite portrayal. He just embodies the drunken swagger of Antony perfectly, and he's a joy to watch on screen.
I see now that you are still the same crude, arrogant lech you always were.
That's right. Just the same. And still fucking your mother!
Octavian is an interesting situation. He's originally played by Max Purkis, who I think does a really good job balancing the precociousness of child Octavian with hinting at his coldness and the ruthlessness that would lead him to becoming Augustus. Simon Woods portrays an older Octavian in Season 2, and while he does a great job showing the cold, lizard-like side of Octavian, it doesn't feel quite as balanced for me as the first portrayal does.
No, I was all sweetness and light with her. Charm itself.
Yes, that is your most disheartening manner.
Though a male-dominated show for the most part, one of the most interesting portrayals is Polly Walker as Attia, the mother of Octavian and Octavia. They actually based Attia not on her historical counterpart, but more on Mark Antony's actual wife, Fulvia. This is why their relationship is such a central part of the series. But even though she's an amalgam character, she's still one of the most fascinating. Constantly scheming for more social power for her family, her arrogance is really fun to watch play off of all the other characters.
I will kill Octavia, and Meryl attends to me, but if she cannot and I am taken alive, then you must kill me. And then you must kill yourself. Your survival would be inappropriate.
However, without a doubt, the best part of the show is not the famous historical figures, but instead two lowborn plebs, Lucius Vorenus and Titus Pullo.
What extraordinary names these plebs have.
These two are the real main characters of the show. Vorenus is a strict, humorless soldier who believes in obedience to the laws and customs of Rome no matter what.
Soldier!
You on duty?
Pullo is a brutish but lovable rogue, concerning himself not with the rules, but instead his own simple desires.
I'm gonna drink all the wine, smoke all the smoke, and fuck every whore in the city.
These two could not be more opposite, but their friendship is the very heart of the show. Together they Forrest Gump their way through Roman history, affecting everything around them, arguably even more so than the famous people. Speaking of which, we should bring up historical accuracy. I'd argue for a television series, they do get a lot right. Things mostly follow the broad strokes of the real history, which is more than many other historical dramas can claim. However, when we get into the weeds, a lot of details are not quite right. Some of this is intentional. Like I said before, they're going for a Forrest Gump thing, where the quote-unquote real history that we all know is not quite correct, and that in reality, smaller, random occurrences affect things much more so than any individual character. They also change some other random details, like the assassination of Caesar happening on the calends of February instead of the Ides of March. But while a lot of this can be forgiven as just the usual compromises of storytelling, one thing that I really dislike is the portrayal of Cicero. They portray him as this cowardly, effeminate weakling, instead of the great statesman that he really was. While I can see what they were doing with a lot of the changes that they made to Attia and Octavia, I really don't know what they were thinking with this portrayal of Cicero.
I will cut off these soft, pink hands and nail them to the Senate door.
Again, I want to emphasize that I don't expect them to get every single detail of history right. At the end of the day, the most important thing is to make an entertaining and engaging show, and they do succeed at that. But if you want a more in-depth dive into the history that is still presented as storytelling, might I recommend Historias Civilis. He's one of my all-time favorite channels on YouTube, and don't let the simple graphics fool you. His content is one of the most engaging that I've ever seen, and I cannot recommend him enough. However, most of the historical accuracies of the show can be attributed to the rushed final season. The series was developed under a 2-year contract between HBO and the BBC, with a total budget of around $100 million for the first season. The show used the budget to realistically portray Rome, building sets and filming on location in Italy where the real history happened. In addition to using a massive amount of extras and real props and costumes, CGI was also extensively used to recreate Rome. While we think of CGI nowadays as a cheaper way to make films, in the early 2000s, it was extremely expensive to use. Rome's first season ended up being one of the most expensive productions HBO ever did, costing more than even Game of Thrones' first season did. The series won a lot of awards and garnered HBO a lot of attention, but the high cost meant that both HBO and the BBC were not eager to pour more money into the show for further seasons after the contract expired. Originally, the series was going to be 5 seasons long. The second season would have ended with the death of Brutus, the third and the fourth dealt with the conflict between Octavian and Mark Antony, and the final season would have actually been about the rise of the Messiah. However, midway into writing season 2, Bruno Heller learned that the season was going to end, and instead had to fit the entire arc into just one season. This is why the conflict between Antony and Octavian feels so rushed, jumping years at a time between episodes. It's so tragic how the series ends. If the show had been given a full run, it might occupy the place in the media that Game of Thrones does today. And there's definitely some resentment that fans of Rome have towards Game of Thrones for essentially stealing their show. Both James Purefoy and Kevin McKidd refused to appear on Game of Thrones because of this, which is a shame, as they both would have been fantastic. But whether you love it or hate it, Game of Thrones would have never happened without Rome. The lessons that HBO learned during the production of Rome allowed them to create shows like Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon at a sustainable budget. Rome walked so that other epic series could run, and it deserves appreciation for that. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for more content coming soon. Salve, patrons. Get it? It's Latin. Matt Joyce, Uncle Mike, Sam Cedarland, Celery Man, Countess von Zarevich, Admiral, Neil Varma, and Juan Jaramillo.